The millionaire's son never walked a single step in his life, trapped in a gilded cage of wealth and privilege. His father's fortune couldn't buy what he needed most, until she arrived with nothing but determination in her worn hands. Who could have imagined that the woman they looked down upon would lift him higher than anyone thought possible? Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. John Smith's penthouse was always filled with silence, not the peaceful kind that brings comfort, but the hollow kind that echoes with absence. The 57th floor apartment, with its panoramic views of the city skyline, marble countertops and designer furniture, felt more like a museum than a home. It had been that way since Elizabeth died 2 years ago, leaving John alone with their son and a grief he didn't know how to navigate. But on one rainy afternoon in October, that silence was shattered by the sound of pure, breathless laughter echoing down the hallway. It was high-pitched and innocent, the unmistakable giggle of a child. John paused at the entrance, his expensive tailored suit soaked from the downpour outside. Water dripped from his shoulders onto the immaculate hardwood floor, forming small puddles around his Italian leather shoes. His briefcase remained clutched in his right hand, knuckles white from the grip he hadn't realized he'd tightened. The billionaire businessman stood frozen, heart pounding at the unfamiliar sound reverberating through his home. He hadn't heard laughter like that in years, not since his wife passed, and certainly not from his son. Michael had always been a quiet child, but after Elizabeth's death, he had retreated further into himself. The 3-year-old barely spoke anymore, his pale face usually expressionless as various specialists and therapists came and went through their lives, offering diagnoses but little hope. John took a hesitant step forward, then another. The sound was coming from the living room, a space that, despite its wall-to-wall windows and expensive art, had felt as lifeless as the rest of their home for too long. Something about that laughter made his chest tighten with an emotion he couldn't immediately identify. Was it hope? Fear? The terrible weight of realizing how long it had been since joy had filled these walls. He loosened his tie with his free hand, suddenly feeling as though he couldn't breathe properly. The smartphone in his pocket buzzed insistently, likely the office calling about the merger he'd left unfinished, but for once John didn't reach for it. Instead, he moved quietly toward the source of that magical sound, drawn by something stronger than business deals or billion-dollar decisions. What could possibly have made Michael laugh like that? And who was with him? The new maid, Sarah Johnson, had only started working for them last week. John had barely exchanged more than necessary instructions with the young woman. Yet somehow she had accomplished what an army of highly paid specialists couldn't. She had made his son laugh. John crept toward the living room, his Italian leather shoes barely making a sound on the polished hardwood floor. Each step felt heavy with a mixture of dread and hope. The sound of laughter, so foreign in this silent penthouse, pulled him forward like a magnet, his heart hammered against his ribs. As he approached the doorway, briefcase still clutched in his rain-dampened hand. What he saw made his world tilt on its axis. Michael Smith, his 3-year-old son, pale and delicate as a porcelain figurine, was actually standing atop someone's feet. The boy's thin arms were outstretched like wings, his usually somber face transformed by pure, uninhibited giggles. His small body trembled not with weakness but with joy, as if nothing in the world could ever hurt him again. Beneath Michael was Sarah Johnson, the new maid John had hired just 2 weeks ago. The young black woman lay on her back on the plush cream carpet, her uniform slightly rumpled, her legs raised in the air. She balanced Michael on the soles of her feet, with surprising strength, lifting him up and down in gentle motions that mimicked flight. Her hands were outstretched, ready to catch him if needed, but there was no fear in her eyes, only warmth and concentration. "You're flying, Michael. Look at you go." Sarah encouraged, her voice melodic and bright. The boy responded with another burst of laughter that seemed to fill every corner of the usually sterile room. John stood frozen in the doorway, unable to process what he was witnessing. For 3 years, specialists had examined his son. Physical therapists had manipulated those little legs. Neurologists had run tests. Psychologists had offered theories. All had ultimately shrugged, saying there was no physical reason the boy couldn't walk. He simply wouldn't. Yet here was Michael, balanced and buoyant, his face alive with an emotion John hadn't seen since before his wife's passing. The boy's eyes sparkled with trust as he gazed down at Sarah, his tiny fingers flexing with excitement. The businessman felt something crack inside his chest, not pain, but the breaking of a wall he hadn't realized he'd built. His son wasn't just a medical puzzle to solve, or a reminder of his failures. He was a child, capable of joy. Neither Sarah nor Michael had noticed him yet, both completely lost in their shared moment of play. John watched, transfixed, as his son, his fragile, silent son, experienced what looked remarkably like happiness in the hands of a stranger. Sarah Johnson possessed none of the credentials that John Smith had paid fortunes for. No medical degree hung on her wall. No therapy certifications lined her resume. What she had instead was something money couldn't buy, a natural confidence that radiated from her warm brown eyes and gentle hands. Those hands now supported Michael as he giggled with pure delight. John stood frozen in the doorway, briefcase still clutched in his grip, his breath caught in his throat as he watched the scene unfold. This wasn't the structured physical therapy sessions he'd witnessed countless times before. There were no clinical instructions, no medical equipment, no progress charts being marked with disappointing results. This was simply play, something his son had been denied in his short life of doctor's appointments and treatments. The young woman lay on her back on the plush carpet of the penthouse living room, her uniform slightly rumpled as she balanced the little boy above her. Michael's pale face was flushed with excitement, his eyes bright with life instead of the usual vacant stare that had haunted John for years. "Look at you go," Sarah encouraged, her voice soft but filled with genuine enthusiasm. "You're flying like a superhero." The father watched as she slowly, carefully lowered his son to the floor beside her. What happened next made John's heart nearly stop. Sarah didn't hover her hands around Michael's waist. She didn't support his elbows or guide his movements. She simply sat back and smiled at him. And Michael Smith, he stood on his own 2 feet, without braces, without support, without the fear that had seemed permanently etched into his small features. The boy's legs, so often described as developmentally delayed by specialists, now held his weight with surprising steadiness. John couldn't breathe. He'd spent millions on experimental treatments, flown in specialists from across the globe, converted an entire room of their penthouse into a private therapy center, all for nothing. Yet here was his son, standing before a maid he'd hired just 2 weeks ago, grinning from ear to ear. Michael's chest rose and fell with excited breaths. His tiny hands clenched in triumph. He looked alive, truly alive in a way John had never witnessed before. The boy's eyes sparkled with something John had almost forgotten existed. In that moment, watching his son stand independently for the first time, John realized that perhaps the healing his family needed couldn't be purchased or prescribed. Perhaps it had been waiting here all along, in the simple magic of human connection. For 3 long years, Michael Smith's legs had been motionless beneath his tiny frame. John had spent millions on specialists from across the United States and beyond, neurologists, physical therapists, developmental experts, all with the same frustrating conclusion: physically, there was nothing wrong with his son. Michael could walk. He just wouldn't. The specialists had their theories: trauma from his mother's death, psychological withdrawal, fear response. Each diagnosis came with its own expensive treatment plan that John had faithfully followed, desperate for results. None came. Eventually, the billionaire businessman had begun to accept what seemed inevitable. His son might never walk. John had retreated into what he knew best: work. 14-hour days at the office meant less time facing his failure as a father. His penthouse became less a home and more a reminder of everything broken in his life. The grief of losing his wife had calcified into a hard shell around him, one that kept out pain but also joy. Now standing in his own doorway, briefcase still clutched in his white-knuckled grip, John couldn't process what he was seeing. His son, his fragile, silent son, had been standing, moving, laughing. Sarah finally noticed his presence. Unlike the parade of specialists and caregivers who had come before her, she didn't startle or look guilty at being caught playing instead of working. Her warm eyes met his, and her smile remained steady, genuine. "Hi, Miss Smith," she greeted softly, as if nothing extraordinary had just happened. As if his son hadn't just defied 3 years of medical predictions, John opened his mouth, but no words came. His expensive suit dripped rainwater onto the hardwood floor. The businessman who commanded boardrooms and negotiated billion-dollar deals couldn't form a single coherent thought. Sarah's calm demeanor was almost maddening. She sat up slowly, straightening her simple clothes, giving Michael a gentle pat on his back. The boy turned toward his father, his small face alight with something John hadn't seen in years. Pure, uncomplicated happiness. What had this woman done in 2 weeks that teams of highly paid professionals couldn't accomplish in years? John felt a complex mixture of emotions crash through him. Hope, confusion, jealousy, and an overwhelming sense that he had missed something fundamental about his own child. The maid, no, she was clearly more than just a maid, waited patiently, letting him process what he'd witnessed. Her hands rested calmly in her lap, her posture relaxed, yet dignified. She seemed to understand the magnitude of the moment without needing to announce it. What is this?" John Smith's voice trembled, barely audible over the thundering of his own heartbeat. His expensive suit still dripped rainwater onto the imported marble floor, creating small puddles that mirrored his wide, disbelieving eyes. With a shy glance, Michael turned at the sound of his father's voice. The small boy's pale face lit up with recognition, his delicate features transforming with a smile that seemed to illuminate the entire penthouse. Then, miraculously, he lifted one foot, then another, then a third, walking 3 unsteady steps straight into his father's arms. The leather briefcase hit the floor with a dull thud as John knelt, documents about merger acquisitions spilling forgotten across the floor. His trembling hands reached out, catching his son's tiny frame. The businessman clutched Michael against his chest, arms shaking uncontrollably as 3 years of medical consultations, specialist appointments, and shattered hopes crashed through his mind. "You're walking," he whispered, his voice breaking. "You're actually walking." Michael just laughed, the sound pure and innocent, completely unaware he'd just turned his father's world upside down. His small fingers gripped John's silk tie, tugging at it, playfully, as though this moment wasn't extraordinary, as though he hadn't just done what teams of physical therapists and medical specialists had failed to accomplish. Sarah stood quietly nearby, her warm eyes taking in the scene with gentle understanding. She made no move to interrupt the moment, allowing father and son this precious reconnection. "I don't understand," John managed, looking up at the young woman while still holding his son. "The doctors said. They all said. He was always capable," Sarah replied softly. "He just needed the right motivation." John's eyes filled with tears he couldn't control. For years he'd thrown money at the problem, the best specialists, cutting-edge therapies, experimental treatments. He'd approached his son's condition like a business challenge to overcome with resources and determination. Yet here was Michael, walking because of simple play with the household maid. The little boy wiggled in his father's embrace, completely oblivious to the significance of what he'd accomplished. To him, this was just another game, another moment of joy in a day that had suddenly become filled with them. John pressed his face against his son's soft hair, inhaling the scent of baby shampoo and childhood innocence. In that moment, the billionaire businessman understood with painful clarity that some miracles couldn't be purchased. They could only be witnessed with gratitude and humility. Michael just laughed again, unaware he'd just turned the world upside down. John Smith looked up at Sarah Johnson, his eyes wide and glistening with tears. The words caught in his throat, barely audible when they finally escaped. "I don't understand." His voice cracked with emotion, the carefully constructed facade of the powerful businessman crumbling in an instant. Sarah only smiled, her warm eyes reflecting a wisdom that transcended her position as a maid. "You don't need to," she said softly. "Just hold him." The billionaire tightened his arms around Michael, feeling his son's small chest rise and fall against his own. When was the last time he had truly held his child like this? Not as a fragile patient to be managed, but as his son to be loved. The realization stung, sharp and clarifying. For months, no years, John had thrown money at the problem. The finest specialists from across the country had paraded through their penthouse, each with their own theories and treatment plans. Physical therapists had manipulated Michael's legs while the boy stared blankly at the ceiling. Neurologists had ordered test after test, their clinical jargon filling notebooks that John kept meticulously organized in his home office. But now, kneeling on his expensive hardwood floor with his suit getting wrinkled, none of that mattered. Not the consultations that cost thousands of dollars per hour, not the experimental treatments he'd flown them to Switzerland for last summer, not the custom equipment gathering dust in the spare bedroom. "How did you know?" he whispered, still watching his son, afraid that if he looked away, Michael might revert to the silent, immobile child he'd been just yesterday. Sarah shifted slightly, her hands clasped in front of her. "I didn't know anything," she admitted. "I just played with him." Children need play more than they need pressure. The simplicity of her answer made John's chest tighten. How many experts had he consulted? How many second opinions had he sought? Yet this woman, whom he'd hired just 2 weeks ago to clean his home, had accomplished what millions of dollars couldn't. Michael stirred in his arms, his small fingers clutching at John's silk tie. The boy looked up at his father with clear eyes, no trace of the vacant stare that had haunted John for so long. "Da," Michael murmured, the half-formed word more precious than any business deal John had ever closed. The businessman pressed his lips to his son's forehead, breathing in the clean scent of his hair. For once he wasn't thinking about conference calls or market projections or the empire he'd built. For once the weight of his wealth felt irrelevant compared to the miracle in his arms. Sarah wiped her hands on her jeans, brushing away invisible dust. Her movements were unhurried, deliberate, as if she had all the time in the world. "Michael didn't need more therapy," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "He needed play. He needed someone to be present." John Smith stared at her, his mind racing through the blur of the past 3 years. Images flashed before him, white-coated specialists with their clipboards, physical therapists with their equipment, neurologists with their scans and complicated terminology. The endless parade of medical bills that he'd paid without question, the experimental treatments he'd authorized, the second and third opinions he'd demanded. "I hired the best doctors in the country," he whispered, more to himself than to her. His fingers trembled slightly as he adjusted his tie, a habit from board meetings when he felt cornered. "I flew in specialists from Europe. I built a therapy room upstairs with equipment that hospitals don't even have yet." Sarah nodded, understanding in her eye. "And that shows how much you love him. But sometimes," she glanced toward Michael, who was now sitting on the floor, completely absorbed in examining the pattern of the carpet. "Sometimes what children need isn't found in medical journals." The billionaire businessman felt something crack inside him, not a breaking but an opening. He remembered the insurance paperwork stacked on his desk, the medical terminology he'd forced himself to learn, the research studies he'd funded. All those resources, all that money, and yet his son had remained unreachable. "I thought I could fix him," John admitted, his voice barely audible. "He was never broken." Sarah replied, her warm eyes meeting his, "Just waiting for someone to stop trying to fix him and start seeing him." John watched his son, truly seeing him perhaps for the first time in years, not as a medical mystery to solve or a problem to overcome, but as a child, his child, who needed connection more than correction. "I've been so focused on making him walk that I forgot to walk alongside him," he said, the realization hitting him with painful clarity. Sarah smiled, a gentle expression that held no judgment. "It's not too late to start." John nodded slowly, feeling the weight of missed bedtime stories, of playtime sacrificed for conference calls, of moments lost to the pursuit of a cure rather than a connection. He'd been physically present in the penthouse, but emotionally absent from his son's life. "How did you know?" he asked, looking at the young woman with newfound respect. "Sometimes," she said softly, "the most important thing isn't what you do, but how fully you're there when you do it." "Why did you care?" John asked, his voice raw with emotion. The question hung in the air between them, heavy with unspoken gratitude and confusion. Sarah Johnson hesitated, her warm eyes clouding with memory. She settled herself on the plush carpet across from him, legs crossed comfortably, as if preparing for a confession. Her gaze remained unwavering, honest in a way that made John feel both seen and exposed. "I lost a child," she said quietly, her fingers absently tracing patterns on the expensive rug beneath them. "Not by blood. I was a live-in nanny for a boy just like Michael." She paused, swallowing hard. "Same age, same gentle spirit, same difficulty walking." John clutched his son closer, feeling Michael's steady breathing against his chest. The billionaire's mind raced, trying to process this revelation from his employee. The penthouse suddenly felt too large, too empty despite their presence. What happened? He managed to ask, though part of him already knew. Sarah's shoulders tensed slightly. His parents were important people, always busy, always rushing. They didn't believe in patience, thought throwing money at specialists would fix everything. Her voice remained steady, but her eyes betrayed old pain. They hired me to manage him, not to love him. Michael stirred in his father's arms, and John found himself instinctively stroking the boy's hair, a gesture he'd performed too rarely before today. There was an emergency one night, Sarah continued. His breathing. I called them, but they were at some fundraiser. She looked down at her hands. By the time they arrived at the hospital, it was too late. He died alone in a hospital bed, with only me there. The silence that followed felt sacred. Outside the penthouse windows, the city continued its relentless pace, unaware of the confessions being shared within these walls. I wasn't there when he left, she confessed, her voice barely above a whisper. I stepped out for just a moment, to speak with the doctor. I'll never forgive myself for that. John felt tears threatening, recognizing in her story his own failures, the meetings he'd prioritized over Michael's therapy sessions, the calls he'd taken during their limited time together. When I saw Michael, Sarah said, looking at the sleeping child, I saw him. I couldn't walk away. Not again. John nodded, understanding flowing between them. In this moment, they weren't employer and employee, just two people connected by their care for one small, fragile boy. Thank you, John whispered, the words inadequate but sincere. Sarah simply nodded, her eyes reflecting both past sorrow and present hope. John Smith's heart clenched as he processed Sarah Johnson's words. The weight of her confession hung in the air between them, heavy with shared grief. Her eyes, usually warm and confident, now held a vulnerability that made her seem younger, more fragile. I wasn't there when he left, she continued, her voice barely above a whisper. I'll never forgive myself for that. Her fingers twisted together in her lap, the only visible sign of her inner turmoil. The family I worked for, they were always busy. The hospital called, but I was the only one who made it in time, almost in time. She paused, swallowing hard. 3 minutes too late. The businessman felt a painful recognition in her words. How many times had he chosen a meeting over spending time with Michael? How many moments had he missed, believing there would always be tomorrow? When I saw Michael, I saw him. Sarah finished, her gaze drifting to the small boy who now sat contentedly arranging blocks on the plush carpet of the penthouse. Not just physically, though they both have that same determined look when they concentrate, but that waiting, that patience, like they know adults need time to figure things out. John blinked away tears, unable to speak. The silence in the luxurious living room felt different now, not the hollow emptiness he'd grown accustomed to, but something alive with possibility. He felt utterly unworthy of this second chance that had arrived in the form of this remarkable woman. I didn't mean to bring this into your home, Sarah said, straightening her shoulders slightly. I just wanted you to understand why. Thank you, John interrupted, his voice rough with emotion. For seeing what I couldn't, for doing what I didn't. Sarah shook her head gently. It's not about what you didn't do, it's about what you can do now. Michael looked up then, as if sensing the emotional current flowing between the adults. He pushed himself up with surprising steadiness and took 3 careful steps toward them before dropping to his knees and crawling the rest of the way to his father. John reached out, his hands trembling slightly as Michael climbed into his lap. The businessman who had negotiated billion-dollar deals without breaking a sweat now found himself overcome by the simple weight of his son against his chest. I don't know how to do this, he admitted, looking at Sarah over Michael's head. Nobody does, she replied with gentle honesty. We just show up and try again tomorrow. Outside, the rain softened to a gentle patter against the penthouse windows, as if the world itself was listening to the miracle unfolding within. The storm that had drenched John Smith's expensive suit earlier was now just a whisper, matching the hushed atmosphere of the room. Inside, something profound was breaking, not in Michael but in John himself. The carefully constructed layers of grief and guilt that had encased his heart for years were peeling away, exposing raw emotion he'd long suppressed. John watched his son's small chest rise and fall as Michael rested against him. The weight of the child felt unfamiliar, yet perfectly right. How long had it been since he'd simply held his boy without simultaneously checking emails or taking calls? The businessman's fingers trembled slightly as they brushed through Michael's fine hair. "I haven't been a father," John whispered, his voice barely audible above the rain. "Just a man living in the same house." The admission hung in the air, heavy with regret. He'd provided everything money could buy. Specialists' therapies, the finest penthouse, every material comfort, yet had withheld the one thing his son truly needed, himself. Sarah Johnson sat across from them, her posture relaxed yet attentive. Her dark eyes held no judgment, only a quiet understanding that made John's confession easier to bear. She'd somehow accomplished in days what teams of highly paid professionals couldn't achieve in years. "You still have time," Sarah responded, her voice steady and kind. The simplicity of her words struck John with unexpected force. Time, the one resource he'd always valued in business but squandered in fatherhood. The one thing his late wife no longer had. Michael stirred slightly in his arms, making a soft sound before settling again. The trust in that small movement nearly undid John completely. His son still believed in him, despite everything. The penthouse that had always felt more like a showroom than a home suddenly seemed different, warmer somehow, as if the walls themselves were exhaling. The expensive furniture and art collections that had once defined success now appeared hollow compared to the miracle of his son's steps. "How do I even begin?" John asked, not really expecting an answer. Sarah's smile was gentle. "You already..." She gestured toward his arms where he cradled Michael. "This is the beginning." The rain continued its gentle rhythm, a soundtrack to this moment of transformation. For the first time in years, John felt something unfamiliar bloom in his chest. Not the sharp pain of loss or the dull ache of guilt, but something warmer, something like hope. Michael stirred in John's arms, his small body warm and fragile against his father's expensive suit. The little boy's eyelids fluttered open briefly, revealing tired but content eyes that gazed up at his father. He let out a tiny yawn, his delicate features softening as he nestled back down against John's chest, completely trusting and at peace. The weight of his son felt different now, not a burden of responsibility and medical worries, but a precious gift John had nearly forgotten how to appreciate. John Smith gazed across the room at Sarah Johnson, woman he'd hired simply to clean his penthouse. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. This wasn't just some fortunate accident. The way she had connected with Michael, the careful way she'd encouraged him, it spoke of experience and intention that went far beyond dusting furniture and washing dishes. "You're not just a maid," he said quietly, his voice barely audible over the gentle patter of rain against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the penthouse. The evening light cast long shadows across the living room, highlighting the toys scattered across the expensive carpet, evidence of play that had been absent for too long. Sarah shrugged, her warm eyes showing neither pride nor defensiveness. She adjusted her position on the sofa, her posture relaxed yet dignified. "I'm not trying to be anything," she replied with the same quiet confidence that had first caught his attention. "I just wanted him to feel safe." The simplicity of her statement made John's throat tight. For 3 years he had thrown his fortune at the problem. Specialists, therapists, experimental treatments, all focused on making Michael walk. Not once had he considered that what his son needed most was simply to feel secure. "Safety," John echoed, the word feeling foreign on his tongue. He looked down at Michael, who had fallen back asleep, his small chest rising and falling with each breath. The businessman gently brushed a strand of hair from his son's forehead, marveling at how peaceful he looked. "It's what we all need," Sarah added softly. "But children especially. They can't heal when they're afraid." John nodded slowly, understanding washing over him. The penthouse had never felt like a home, not since his wife had passed. It had been a place of silence and grief, of clinical discussions and medical equipment. No wonder Michael had retreated into himself. "Thank you," he whispered, the words inadequate for the gift she had given them both. Sarah simply smiled in response, her expression suggesting she understood exactly what those two words contained: gratitude, respect, and the first tentative steps towards something like hope. "You did what none of them could," John Smith said, voice shaking with emotion. His eyes glistened as he cradled his son against his chest, still unable to fully process the miracle he had witnessed. Countless specialists, therapists and medical professionals had failed where this woman had succeeded in just days. Sarah Johnson shook her head gently, her warm eyes reflecting the afternoon light streaming through the penthouse windows. "I didn't heal him. I just helped him find himself." Her voice carried no pride, only quiet certainty. John looked down at Michael, who was breathing peacefully against his chest for the first time in years. The little boy's small fingers curled around the fabric of his father's expensive suit jacket, holding on with surprising strength. Gratitude and awe mingled in John's heart as he watched his son's eyelids flutter, the child completely at ease. "We have the best doctors in the country," John continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "Specialists from Switzerland, physical therapists who worked with Olympic athletes. I spent millions," he trailed off, the weight of all those failed attempts pressing down on him. Sarah shifted in her seat, her posture relaxed but attentive. "Medicine has its place," she said carefully, "but sometimes what children need isn't in any text." John nodded, remembering all the clinical terms the doctors had used: developmental delay, psychological barriers, trauma response. None of them had suggested simply playing with his son, being present with him. "How did you know?" he asked, studying Sarah's face. "What made you think you could help him when everyone else had given up?" Sarah's expression softened. "I didn't know I could help him. I just saw a little boy who needed someone to see him. Not his condition, not his limitations, just him." She paused, watching Michael's peaceful face. Children are remarkably resilient when they feel safe enough to try. John felt a tear escape despite his efforts to maintain composure. He had built an empire, accumulated wealth beyond imagination, yet had somehow failed at the most fundamental task: creating a safe haven for his child. "Thank you," he managed, the words wholly inadequate for the gift she had given them both. Sarah smiled, the gesture reaching her eyes. "Don't thank me yet. This is just the beginning. Michael has always had the strength inside him, now he knows it too." She glanced toward the kitchen. "Would you like me to prepare something for him when he wakes up?" John shook his head, tightening his hold on his son ever so slightly. "No, I think I'll just sit here with him a while longer." Sarah Johnson leaned against the doorframe, her eyes fixed on Michael Smith as he played with his blocks on the living room floor. The little boy's face was alight with concentration, a stark contrast to the withdrawn child she'd first met weeks ago. She waited until John had finished helping his son build a small tower before speaking. "He'll need consistency," Sarah said, her voice gentle but firm. "He's still afraid not of walking but of being abandoned." John looked up, his expensive suit jacket discarded on the sofa, sleeves rolled up to his elbows. The billionaire businessman who once rushed through the penthouse with barely a glance at his son now sat cross-legged on the carpet, fully present. "What do you mean?" he asked, though his eyes suggested he already knew the answer. Sarah crossed the room and knelt beside them, careful not to disturb Michael's creation. Children sense patterns. He's starting to trust that good things can happen, but that trust is fragile. She watched as Michael reached for another block, his small fingers steady. One day of attention followed by a week of absence will teach him that connection isn't reliable. John's face shadowed with guilt. He remembered countless mornings of hurried goodbyes, evenings of missed bedtimes, and the mountain of work that had seemed more urgent than his son's silent suffering. "I'll stay home," John's promise came out as a vow, his voice thick with emotion. "More off. I'll reschedule meetings, delegate more to the executive team." Sarah nodded, her expression serious. "He'll know if you mean it." She glanced at Michael, who was now watching them both, sensing the importance of their conversation. Children don't understand explanations, but they understand presence. They track it like scientists. John reached out and gently touched his son's hair. "I've missed so much already." "You haven't missed everything," Sarah replied. "But healing isn't a single moment, it's thousands of small moments strung together. Consistency creates safety. Michael abandoned his blocks and crawled into his father's lap, a gesture so natural yet so new that John's eyes glistened with unshed tears. "I don't know how to thank you," he whispered to Sarah. The young woman shook her head. "Don't thank me. Just be here. Not just physically, be here emotionally." She stood up, brushing invisible dust from her jeans. The fancy specialists weren't wrong about what Michael needed. They just couldn't prescribe the one thing money can't buy. "What's that?" John asked, arms wrapped protectively around his son. "Time," Sarah answered simply. "Unrushed, undivided time." The next morning, sunlight poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the penthouse, bathing the living room in a warm, golden glow. But it wasn't just the light that transformed the space. It was John Smith's presence that changed everything. For the first time in years, there was no rushing to work, no hurried goodbyes, no promises to be home early that both father and son knew would be broken. John had called his office before Michael even woke up. "Family emergency," he'd said simply, and for once it wasn't a lie. This was an emergency, the emergency of a father nearly missing his son's childhood. Now he sat cross-legged on the plush area rug, his crisp white dress shirt a stark contrast to the casual setting. He'd rolled up his sleeves meticulously, cufflinks placed carefully on the coffee table. The businessman still existed in those careful gestures, but something else was emerging. A father rediscovering his role. Michael knelt across from him, small fingers carefully stacking colorful blocks. The boy's movements were deliberate, his concentration absolute. Every few minutes he would glance up at his father, as if making sure he was still there, still watching. Each time John would smile, and Michael would return to his task with renewed confidence. "That's quite a tower," John said softly, resisting the urge to reach for his smartphone when it buzzed in his pocket. The device could wait. The world outside could wait. Michael didn't respond verbally. He rarely did. But his eyes lit up at the acknowledgement. He added another block, then another, his pale face flushed with concentration. John found himself studying his son's movements, noticing things he'd missed before, how Michael's left hand was slightly steadier than his right, how he bit his lower lip when focusing, how his breathing quickened with excitement as the tower grew tall. These were the details that money couldn't buy, that specialists couldn't document in their reports. These were the pieces of his son that John had been too busy to notice. When the tower wobbled dangerously, John resisted the urge to reach out and stabilize it. Instead, he watched, heart in his throat, as Michael adjusted his approach, placing the next block with extra care. "You're doing great," John whispered, not wanting to break his son's concentration, but unable to contain his pride. For once, John wasn't thinking about meetings or investments or the empire he'd built. He was simply being there, quietly present, watching his son build something of his own. Michael wobbled unsteadily on his small legs, his pale face scrunched in concentration as he reached for a colorful wooden block just beyond his grasp. The movement threw off his delicate balance, and he tumbled sideways onto the plush carpet of the penthouse living room. John Smith's heart jumped into his throat, his body tensing instinctively to rush forward. But something stopped him, Sarah's gentle lessons echoing in his mind. Instead of swooping in, the billionaire father watched, breath held, as his 3-year-old son pushed himself up with determination. Michael's small hands pressed against the floor, his thin arms trembling slightly with effort. Then, astonishingly, a smile broke across his face, not frustration or fear, but the pure joy of trying again. "That's it," John whispered, barely audible even to himself. He remained cross-legged on the floor, fighting every paternal instinct to intervene, to make things easier. For 3 years he had thrown money at specialists, therapies and equipment, anything to fix what he thought was broken. Michael steadied himself and reached once more for the block, this time with more careful movements. His tiny fingers closed around it triumphantly, and he turned to his father with eyes bright with accomplishment. "Dad, look!" The boy's voice, so rarely heard before Sarah came into their lives, filled the sunlit room. John nodded, his throat too tight for words. This was healing happening before his eyes, not the kind documented in medical journals or measured in clinical assessments. This was a miracle in slow motion, the kind that comes not from money or medicine, but from patience and faith. The boy toddled 3 steps toward his father, clutching his prize. Each wobbly step represented mountains moved, barriers broke. John remembered the countless specialists in their expensive offices, the pitying looks, the careful explanations about psychological blocks and physical therapy regimens. None had achieved what simple presence had. Michael placed the block carefully atop their growing tower, then clapped his hands with delight when it didn't topple. John found himself clapping too, celebrating this small victory as if it were the most important achievement in the world. And perhaps it was. In that moment, the penthouse felt different, warmer somehow despite its minimalist luxury. The silence that had haunted these rooms for years since his wife's passing had been replaced by something alive and breathing hope. The little boy reached for another block, determination written across his features, ready to try again, to risk falling for the joy of standing. Sarah Johnson stood in the kitchen doorway, a white cotton towel draped over her hands, silently observing the scene before her. The morning light streamed through the penthouse windows, casting a golden glow over John and Michael on the living room floor. Her eyes shone with unmistakable pride as she watched the billionaire businessman sitting cross-legged on an expensive rug, his tailored shirt sleeves rolled up, completely absorbed in his son's world. "You look surprised," she said gently, her voice carrying across the room. John Smith looked up, his expression a mixture of wonder and disbelief. He hadn't noticed her standing there, too captivated by the sight of Michael stacking colorful blocks with determination. "I am," he admitted, running a hand through his hair. "I used to think he was broken." The word hung in the air between them, heavy with regret. All those specialists, the therapies, the medications. I thought we needed to fix him. Sarah shook her head, stepping into the room. He was never broken, just waiting for someone to stop rushing. She placed the towel on a nearby table and moved closer, her movements unhurried and deliberate. Michael knocked over his tower of blocks, giggling as they scattered across the floor. Instead of frustration, his face showed pure delight at the chaos he'd created. He immediately began gathering them again, his small hands working with newfound confidence. "Look at him," John whispered. 3 years of expensive treatments, and all he needed was... He trailed off, unable to finish. "Patience," Sarah supplied, "and presence. Your presence." The businessman nodded, swallowing hard. He watched as his son carefully balanced one block atop another, his tongue poking out in concentration. When Michael successfully placed a 3rd block, he looked up at his father with such pride that John felt his chest tighten. "I've been so focused on results," he confessed. "Milestones, progress reports, development charts. I never just sat with him like this." Sarah smiled knowingly. "Children heal differently than we expect. They don't follow our timelines." Michael wobbled to his feet then, taking 3 unsteady steps toward his father before tumbling into his lap. John caught him instinctively, his hands gentle and sure. The boy laughed, a sound that still felt miraculous in the once silent penthouse. "I've missed so much," John said quietly, holding his son close. "But you're here now," Sarah reminded him. "That's what matters to him." As Michael nestled against his chest, John looked up at the woman who had changed everything, not with medicine or therapy or expensive interventions, but with something far simpler and infinitely more powerful: the courage to be present. John Smith stood in the middle of the living room, shoulders heavy as if carrying the weight of the entire penthouse. Sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating the scattered toys across the plush carpet. The billionaire businessman ran his fingers through his hair, watching his son stack colorful blocks with newfound determination. "I rushed everything, his healing, his childhood, even my grief," he confessed, his voice barely above a whisper. The realization struck him with painful clarity. For years he'd thrown money at specialists' therapies and treatments, believing that his wealth could somehow accelerate Michael's recovery. He'd scheduled back-to-back appointments, flying in experts from across the country, all while missing the simplest solution. Sarah Johnson observed him quietly from across the room. Her eyes, warm and knowing, held no judgment, only understanding. She moved toward him with the unhurried grace that seemed to define her every interaction with Michael. "Children aren't broken devices we can fix with the right tools," she said softly. "They're more like gardens. They grow at their own pace, The young woman reached down to a basket of toys and selected a small green dinosaur, Michael's favorite. Its plastic surface was worn smooth from countless hours of play. She held it out to John, her expression gentle but firm. "You don't fix it," she said. "You stay, you show up. That's it." John accepted the toy, turning it over in his hand. How simple it sounded, yet how profoundly he had failed at this basic principle. He'd been physically present in the penthouse, signing checks and hiring staff, but emotionally absent, buried in work, grief and the desperate search for solutions. "I thought I was doing everything right," he admitted. "The best doctors, the most advanced treatments." Sarah nodded. "Those things matter, but Michael needed something medicine couldn't provide." The father looked over at his son, who was now carefully balancing a red block atop his growing tower. The child's tongue poked out slightly in concentration, a gesture so ordinary, so precious. John felt his throat tight. "He needed me," John whispered, the truth of it settling deep in his chest. "Yes," Sarah confirmed. "Not your money, not your connections, just you." John clutched the dinosaur, feeling its worn edges press against his palm. In his pursuit of fixing everything quickly, he'd missed countless moments like this one, quiet afternoons of play, of simply being present. The irony wasn't lost on him. A man who could buy anything in the world had failed to give his son the one thing that was free. John Smith knelt beside his son, the toy dinosaur held out like a peace offering. The gesture was simple, but the meaning behind it was profound. For years, the businessman had tried to solve his son's condition with money and specialists, but now he understood that what Michael truly needed was something money couldn't buy: his presence. Michael's small fingers reached for the dinosaur, his eyes lighting up with quiet delight. The toy wasn't anything special, just a plastic figurine with faded green paint, but the way his son clutched it made it seem like the most precious gift in the world. Without hesitation, Michael crawled into his father's lap and curled up, his tiny body fitting perfectly against John's chest, as if he'd always belonged there. The penthouse remained quiet, except for Michael's soft breathing. John marveled at how natural this felt, how right. For so long he had kept his distance, afraid of his own inadequacy, terrified that he might somehow make things worse. Now, with his son's warmth against him, those fears seemed ridiculous. Sarah watched from across the room, her expression a mixture of joy and validation. She didn't need to say anything. Her presence was enough, a gentle reminder that healing didn't require complicated therapies or expensive treatments. Sometimes it just needed patience and love. "Roar," Michael whispered, making the dinosaur dance across his father's arm. John laughed, a sound that seemed to surprise even himself. When was the last time he had laughed freely in this home? There was no fear in Michael's eyes now, no hesitation in his movements. The trust between them, so fragile for so long, had finally been given and received. John realized that in trying to fix his son, he had missed the opportunity to simply know him. "Daddy play?" Michael asked, offering the dinosaur back to his father. John took it with reverence, as if being handed something sacred. "Yes," he answered, his voice thick with emotion. "Daddy will play." Sarah quietly stepped back toward the kitchen, giving father and son the space they needed. This moment wasn't about her, it was about a connection being rebuilt, about a family finding its way back to each other. As Michael giggled at his father's exaggerated dinosaur roars, John felt something shift inside him, a wall crumbling, a weight lifting. For the first time since losing his wife, he wasn't just going through the motions of fatherhood. He was fully present, fully alive, and somehow, miraculously, so was his son. "I can't believe I almost missed this," John whispered, voice cracking as he watched Michael playing with his blocks on the living room floor. The afternoon light streamed through the penthouse windows, casting a golden glow over his son's concentrated face. Sarah Johnson smiled softly from where she sat cross-legged nearby. "You didn't. You're here now." Her words carried no judgment, only gentle reassurance. She reached over to straighten one of the blocks Michael had placed precariously on his tower, her movements natural and unhurried. John ran his hand through his hair, the expensive watch on his wrist catching the light. For years he'd measured success in dollars and deals, not moments like these. The silence between them was comfortable now, not the oppressive quiet that had once filled every corner of their home. "I spent 3 years throwing money at specialists," he admitted, watching his son's small fingers grasp another block. "But you showed up and did what none of them could in just days." Sarah shook her head. "I didn't do anything special. I just gave him time and space to feel safe." She smiled as Michael successfully balanced another block, clapping softly when he looked up for approval. The businessman studied her face, noting the quiet confidence in her eye. In the weeks since that first breakthrough, she had become essential to their lives in ways he couldn't have imagined. Not just for Michael's progress, but for the way she'd shown John how to be present again. "Will you stay?" he asked suddenly, the question hanging between them. Vulnerability wasn't something John Smith was accustomed to showing, but with Sarah, the walls he'd built seemed unnecessary. Sarah raised an eyebrow, a playful smile touching her lips. "As his nanny," she teased gently, though her eyes held a serious question. John felt his heart race, surprised by his own boldness. He hadn't planned to ask, hadn't even realized how much he wanted her to stay until the words left his mouth. But watching her with Michael, seeing how she'd brought life back into their home, he couldn't imagine returning to the emptiness of before. Michael looked up at that moment, as if sensing the importance of the conversation. He abandoned his blocks and toddled over to Sarah, placing his small hand on her knee with complete trust. The gesture said everything about what she meant to them both. John watched them, this unlikely family forming in the aftermath of grief, and for the first time in years, he felt something like hope taking root where only duty had lived before. "No," John said, his voice carrying a weight that hadn't been there before. "As part of our lives." His eyes, usually calculating the value of every business deal, now held something far more precious: hope. Sarah Johnson's smile faded, a complex emotion flickering across her face. She looked down at Michael, who was arranging his blocks in a careful line on the expensive penthouse carpet, completely at peace. "If I stay," she said carefully, "it's as someone who keeps you accountable, not just to Michael, but to the man you want to become." Her gaze was steady, unwavering. "I won't be just another employee you can dismiss when things get difficult." John nodded, tears threatening again. His usual boardroom composure had crumbled in these past few days, replaced by something far more human. "Deal," he whispered. Michael looked up, sensing the shift in the room. He abandoned his blocks and walked, still wobbly but growing stronger with each day, toward his father. John lifted him effortlessly, cradling him close, as if to make up for all the times he'd been too busy with his smartphone to notice his son needed him. "We'll need to take it slow," Sarah cautioned, her experience as a former nanny evident in her practical tone. "For all of us." The morning sunlight streamed through the penthouse windows, casting long golden rectangles across the floor. Outside, the city hummed with activity, deals being made, fortunes changing hands. But inside this space, something far more valuable was taking shape. "I think I can manage that," John replied, a small smile forming. "My company has survived without me these past few days. It can survive a few more." Sarah reached out, straightening Michael's small shirt collar with a gentle touch. "He needs consistency more than anything. Not just today or tomorrow, but every day." "I understand," John said, and for the first time in years, he truly did. The billions in his accounts, the empire he'd built while his son sat alone, none of it mattered compared to the weight of his child in his arms. Michael reached out unexpectedly, grabbing Sarah's hand and pulling it toward them, creating a circle of three. The gesture, so simple yet profound, brought fresh tears to John's eyes. In that quiet room, beneath the morning sun, a new family formed, not by blood or contract, but by choice. The billionaire, the fragile boy, and the woman who had taught them both to see what truly mattered. And that finally was enough.